My daughter stood at the top of my porch steps and watched her husband shove me off them. I went down all 4 steps backward, hit the concrete walkway, and lay there listening to his footsteps walk away. He didn't look back. She didn't move. The last thing I heard before their car door slammed was my daughter saying, "He'll come around by Monday. They always do." I had a flip phone in my coat pocket. I've carried one every day for 30 years. Old habit from running job sites where cell towers were spotty and landlines were a half-mile walk. I reached into that pocket while my right wrist screamed at me, and my ribs felt like broken glass, and I made one call. What happened next cost them everything. And I mean everything. My name is Leland Graves. I'm 67 years old, and I want to tell you exactly how I dismantled the lives of the 2 people I trusted most. Before I do, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Hit like if you believe that sharing your blood with someone doesn't entitle them to share your life's work. And subscribe, because what happened to me is a story that every parent over 50 needs to hear. The argument started on a Tuesday in September, over a manila folder sitting on my kitchen table. I built Graves Custom Construction over 31 years from a one-truck operation into a company with 18 full-time employees and a reputation that stretched across 4 counties in central Ohio. I poured concrete, framed walls, managed subcontractors, and worked through 2 recessions without laying off a single man. When I turned 62, I sold the business to a regional firm for more money than I'd ever expected to see in one place. I paid off every debt I carried. I put a clean title on the 4-bedroom house I'd owned since before my daughter was born. I bought myself a decent truck and put the rest somewhere it couldn't disappear. I wasn't rich the way people use that word to mean something careless. I was secure. I had worked for it the only way that matters, with my hands, my word, and my time. My wife, Donna, passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, the house got quieter than I knew how to manage. So when my daughter called and said she and her husband were going through a rough stretch and could they stay for a few months while they got back on their feet, I said yes without hesitation. She was my only child. That house still had her bedroom in it. Of course I said yes. That was 22 months before the porch. My son-in-law runs a landscaping company. He's 38 years old, and he's been on the verge of something big ever since I met him at my daughter's college graduation 8 years ago. He has the kind of confidence that comes before the work, instead of after it. Loud opinions at dinner, always talking about scaling up, always explaining why his last setback wasn't really his fault. When they moved in, he was 6 months behind on equipment loans and had just lost his 2 biggest commercial contracts to a competitor. My daughter told me they needed to cut expenses while he rebuilt. I gave them the master bedroom. I took the smaller room down the hall. I told them to treat the house like their own. That turned out to be a precise description of exactly what they did. Within 4 months, he had moved my workbench out of the garage to make room for his truck. Within 6 months, I was buying the groceries while he drove a leased pickup with leather seats and heated mirrors. I paid the utilities. I mowed my own lawn, which was almost funny given his profession. My daughter stopped asking how I was doing. She started managing me, scheduling doctor appointments I hadn't requested, asking pointed questions about my memory, sighing whenever I said something she didn't want to hear. I watched all of it. I didn't say much. I'd spent 30 years reading people across job sites and contract tables, and I know the difference between someone who's struggling and someone who's angling. My son-in-law was angling. The manila folder on my kitchen table that Tuesday contained a brochure for Sycamore Ridge Care Community, a state-assisted facility 40 minutes north of Columbus. Clipped behind it was a set of documents I recognized immediately, a quitclaim deed for my house and a transfer of financial power of attorney, my name printed neatly on the lines that still needed a signature. My daughter was leaning against the counter with her arms crossed. Her husband stood by the back door, rolling a toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. She told me it was time to have a real conversation. She said I was getting up there, that I'd had 2 dizzy spells in the last year, both cleared by my own doctor as nothing, and that a man my age living alone in a house this size was a liability waiting to happen. She said the responsible thing, the dignified thing, was to transition somewhere I'd be properly looked after. I picked up the quitclaim deed. I read the first 2 paragraphs. Then I put it down. I asked her, What made her think I was going to pick up that pen? Her husband pushed off the wall. He told me to stop being dramatic. He said they needed the equity in the house to expand the landscaping operation. Commercial contracts lined up, new equipment required. He said I wasn't using the house for anything important, and if I was reasonable, they'd make sure I was comfortable at Sycamore Ridge. I told him this house was paid for, with 31 years of work. I told him he was welcome to pack his things and be gone by Friday. His expression didn't change. He stared at me the way a man stares at something he's already decided is finished. My daughter stepped directly in front of me. Her voice dropped flat and quiet. She said the 2 dizzy spells were documented. She said she had already spoken to an elder care attorney about conservatorship. She said a judge would have questions. I reached past her toward the phone on the kitchen wall. That's when her husband moved. He put both hands on my chest and drove me backward through the screen door and across the porch. I had 1 second to find my footing before my heel caught the top step. I went down all 4 steps in one continuous backward fall. My right wrist hit the concrete first, trying to catch myself, and I felt the bone give. My back and left side followed and drove the air out of my lungs. I lay on that walkway and stared up at the gray Ohio sky. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard my daughter's voice from the porch, calm as someone reading off a grocery list. She said, "He'll come around by Monday. They always do." Her husband added one more sentence before he closed the front door. He said, "Let him think it over out there." I heard the deadbolt click, heard their footsteps move through the house toward the back. 20 minutes later, both car doors, the engine, the sound of his truck leaving the driveway. They were heading to a rental cabin up near Lake Erie for the long weekend. I had suggested the trip back in August. I had paid the deposit as a gift. The street was quiet. Late afternoon, most neighbors still at work. I did a careful inventory. Right wrist, broken or close to it. 2 ribs on the left side that felt wrong with every breath. Nothing else seemed life-threatening. I lay still and let the physical pain settle in while something older and colder moved in behind it. 31 years of building something. Donna's house. My daughter's old bedroom at the end of the hall. I didn't feel grief. What I felt was clarity, the specific kind that arrives when the last thing you were still hoping for stops being possible. I reached into my left coat pocket. The old Motorola flip phone was there, same as every day. I'd carried one since the early 90s. My right hand was useless. I worked the phone open with my left and dialed from memory. It rang twice. My attorney, a man named Strickland, who had handled every serious legal matter of my business life for 24 years, answered on the second ring. I told him where I was and what had just happened. I told him my wrist was broken and I needed an ambulance called to my address. Then I told him to activate the contingency. He went quiet for exactly 1 second. "All of it?" he asked. "All of it," I said. The contingency was something Strickland and I had drafted 14 months earlier, not long after my son-in-law moved a stranger's truck into my garage and started eating at my table every night without once saying thank you. I want to be clear about something. I didn't build it because I wanted to hurt anyone. I built it because 31 years of business taught me that hope is not a legal instrument, and that the people most likely to underestimate you are the ones living inside your house. Here's what my son-in-law did not know. When I saw the state of his finances after they moved in, I didn't hand him cash. Cash had already failed him twice with other ventures. Instead, through a holding company Strickland and I had registered called Ridgecroft Property and Capital, I quietly purchased the commercial building at 4800 Eastbrook Industrial Drive. The property where my son-in-law leased his business headquarters, his equipment bay, and his maintenance yard. He had no idea who owned it. He paid his rent to a property management company. That company reported to Ridgecroft. Ridgecroft was mine. I also became the silent guarantor on his commercial line of credit, the financing that allowed him to buy the mowers, trailers, and specialty trucks that let him land bigger contracts in the first place. The bank approved that credit because Ridgecroft backed it. He signed a 30-page agreement the day it closed without reading past the dollar figure on the front page. Most people don't. Buried in that agreement was a clause Strickland had insisted on. If the borrower engaged in criminal conduct, elder financial abuse, or any documented act of physical harm against an elderly dependent, Ridgecroft had the unilateral right to revoke its guarantee immediately, triggering full repayment of the outstanding balance within 72 hours. He owed $240,000 against that line. His company couldn't cover a tenth of that on its best day. When I said activate the contingency, I was pulling every lever at once. The ambulance arrived 30 minutes after Strickland called it in. A police officer came with them. He walked the property, noted the locked front door, and crouched down next to me on the walkway. He asked directly how I came to be lying outside my own house with a broken wrist. I told him I'd been carrying a box off the porch and lost my balance. I said my daughter and her husband were away for the weekend, and I'd managed to lock myself out in the fall. He wrote it down without looking convinced. He asked for my daughter's contact information. I told him she was up north and I'd handle it myself. He handed me his card before the paramedics loaded me in. I tucked it into my shirt pocket. I wasn't ready for the police yet. A simple assault charge against a man with a business and a seat on the local Chamber of Commerce would result in a plea arrangement and a fine and a story about a misunderstanding. I needed my daughter and her husband to believe they had won. I needed them walking back through my front door, thinking they owned everything inside it. At the hospital, they set my wrist under sedation, 2 cracked ribs on the left side. The orthopedist told me I'd have full function back in 8 weeks. I thanked him and asked to speak to my attorney the moment I was out of recovery. By Wednesday morning, Strickland had moved on every front. Ridgecroft had formally notified the bank of the credit guarantee revocation. My son-in-law's commercial line was in immediate default status. His business accounts were frozen pending resolution of the outstanding balance. Simultaneously, Ridgecroft issued a notice of lease termination for 4800 Eastbrook Industrial Drive. A process server delivered it to the building at 8:15 Wednesday morning. My daughter and her husband were still at the lake cabin. They came back Sunday evening, walked into the house they believed they now owned. The documents I had signed contained a flaw they apparently hadn't noticed, which I'll explain shortly, and poured themselves wine from my cabinet. Monday morning, my son-in-law drove to his shop and found 6 employees standing outside locked doors with a termination notice taped to the front window. When he tried to wire a legal retainer from his business account, every account showed frozen and zero accessible balance. He called the bank. The manager read him the guarantee revocation clause in flat administrative language. My son-in-law is not a man who loses his composure quietly. I'm told the manager held the phone away from his ear. Then he drove to the hospital. They came into my room together. My daughter went first, arms wide, voice breaking on my name. My son-in-law stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in his pockets, jaw set, eyes scanning the room. The nurse quietly stepped out and pulled the door shut. My daughter sat on the edge of my bed and held my good hand. She told me how frightened she'd been when she got the call. She talked about how much she loved me. She used the word argument to describe what happened on the porch, not the word shove, and not the word concrete. My son-in-law pulled a chair over and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He told me the bank situation was clearly an administrative error his attorney was already handling. He said they could sort all of that out. But first he needed me to understand that the original plan, me at Sycamore Ridge, them taking the house, was still the most sensible path for everyone. He slid a new manila folder onto my tray table. Fresh documents. He placed a pen beside them. He said I could sign today and make everything simple, or I could make it complicated and find out how a judge ruled on a man my age with 2 documented dizzy spells. My daughter squeezed my hand. Her eyes were wet and perfectly steady at the same time. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up the pen. I signed every page they put in front of me. My handwriting looked shaky. My hand looked like the hand of a man who had run out of options. My son-in-law watched each signature and visibly relaxed with everyone. When I finished the last page, my daughter gathered the documents to her chest and stood. She kissed me on the forehead. It was the most chilling thing I have ever felt. Her husband straightened his jacket and told me they'd take good care of the house. The door swung shut. I waited 10 seconds. Then I reached under my pillow and pulled out the burner phone. Strickland had left with a nurse the night before. He answered before the first ring finished. I told him they'd taken the bait. He told me the notary was already in the building. At 11 that night, Strickland came to my room with an independent notary and a document set that made the papers my daughter had just taken home look like a printout from a free legal website. The first document was a complete revocation of everything I had signed that evening, executed before an independent notary while I was demonstrably of sound mind, which rendered my daughter's copies void under Ohio law the moment the notary stamped the page. The second was a formal recording of the house deed under Ridgecroft's name. My daughter's quitclaim transfer was meaningless because I had not privately owned the property for 14 months. You cannot sign away what you no longer hold. The third froze all accounts against any claims under the power of attorney she believed she controlled. I signed all three with my left hand, slowly, clearly, no shaking at all. I told Strickland to contact Detective Pruitt. What I haven't yet mentioned is the camera. When Donna was alive, she'd slipped in the driveway one winter. Nothing serious, a bruised hip, but it rattled me enough that I installed a full exterior security system shortly afterward. 4 cameras. Front porch, back deck, driveway, side garage, entrance. All of them feeding to a cloud server around the clock. My daughter and her husband knew there was an alarm panel by the front door. They did not know about the exterior lenses or the cloud storage, because I had never mentioned it, and they had never thought to ask. The camera above the porch light had recorded everything. It had recorded her husband's hands on my chest. It had recorded me going backward down the steps. It had recorded my daughter standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. And it had recorded, in clean audio, her saying the words, "He'll come around by Monday. They always do." And him saying, "Let him think it over out there." And the sound of the deadbolt engaging from inside my house while I lay on the concrete below. Strickland had pulled the footage within the hour I called him from the walkway. He transmitted it to Detective Pruitt on Thursday. Pruitt spent 2 days building the case quietly. He was waiting for the moment they were comfortable and settled back inside the property. That moment came on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the porch. I was there when it happened. Strickland arranged a private car to bring me to the house. I sat in the back seat with my cast and my attorney beside me and watched through the front window as a plain sedan and one marked unit pulled up. Pruitt and 2 officers walked to the door. My daughter answered in a silk robe I recognized. It had been Donna's, holding a coffee mug. When she saw Pruitt's badge, she tried the performance she always tried. Confusion, concern, the devoted daughter who couldn't imagine why police would appear at her door. Pruitt asked if they could come inside. She let them in. Strickland and I followed 30 seconds later. She saw me come through the door, cast on my wrist, attorney at my side, and for the first time in my adult life I watched my daughter's face do something it had never done in front of me before. Not grief, the specific, uncontrollable panic of someone who realizes they have badly miscalculated. Her husband came downstairs in a t-shirt and stopped halfway down when he saw the room. Detective Pruitt read them their rights in the kitchen of my own house, surrounded by Donna's things and 30 years of everything I'd built, while I stood at the back wall and watched. My son-in-law's charges: felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and criminal intimidation. My daughter's charges: complicity in elder abuse, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and criminal exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Her husband sat down heavily in a kitchen chair while the officer cuffed him. He said nothing. The man who had explained to me at my dinner table why traditional businessmen couldn't understand the modern economy put his wrists together and looked at the floor. The trial took 11 months. My son-in-law was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 7 years in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction with eligibility for parole after 4. The landscaping business was gone. The equipment loans were in permanent default. There was nothing left to go back to. My daughter pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of criminal exploitation of an adult. Her attorney negotiated it down in exchange for her testimony about the planning that had preceded the incident on the porch. She received 3 years of supervised probation, mandatory community service, full restitution, and a no-contact order barring her from communicating with me for the duration of her sentence. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. I sat on my back deck that afternoon with a cup of black coffee and looked at the yard where Donna planted tomatoes every spring without fail. The wrist healed fully. The ribs took longer, but they healed too. The house is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet now, One I chose, not one that was forced on me. I want to say one honest thing before I finish, because I think people expect a story like this, to end with a man feeling like he won something. I didn't feel like I won. What I felt, sitting on that deck, was what you feel when a very long job is finally done. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the clean, certain knowledge that the thing you built is still standing, and the people who tried to pull it down are gone. And I want to answer the question that I know is sitting in the back of your mind, because it deserves a real answer. Why do we keep giving to people who only take? I kept giving because she was my daughter, and I did not want to believe what I was watching. I kept finding explanations that were kinder than the truth. That's not weakness. That's what love does when it doesn't yet have enough information. Now I have all the information I need. If you're watching this and something in this story sounds familiar, if someone close to you has started asking questions about your property, your accounts, your estate, has started talking about care facilities you haven't asked about, pay attention to that feeling in your chest. That discomfort is not paranoia. It is data. Don't wait until you're on a concrete walkway at 67 years old to act on it. Get your documents in order. Know who controls what. Keep a phone in your pocket. And remember that the people who underestimate you because of your age are making an assumption that is going to cost them far more than they ever planned to take. I am living proof of exactly that.